Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The sound of tires squealing against the asphalt cut through the silence of the quiet morning in Brookhaven, an elegant suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Jessica Morton braked sharply in her Tesla Model Y, narrowly avoiding colliding with a BMW Series 3 that occupied her private driveway. Once again, Barbara Mitchell had ignored all warnings and parked where she shouldn't have. Jessica felt the blood boil in her veins as she watched the intruding vehicle through the windshield. After 12 years dedicated to neurosurgery at Emory University Hospital, she had finally managed to buy her dream home, an elegant two-story colonial on Peachtree Road. The property had everything she had ever wanted, including a private driveway spacious enough for 2 cars. However, since moving in 3 months ago, her neighbor had turned this achievement into a nightmare. Taking a deep breath to keep her composure, Jessica got out of the car and walked over to the neighboring house. Barbara's impeccable garden, with its strategically placed garden dwarfs and meticulously trimmed flowers, reflected the controlling personality of its owner. Before I could ring the bell, the door opened. "A good morning, doctor." Barbara emerged with her artificial smile, her blonde hair perfectly groomed at 7 in the morning. "I suppose you'd like to talk about the car?" "Yes, Barbara. For the 10th time this month, you're parked in my private driveway." Jessica maintained the professional tone that years of medical practice had taught her. "We've been over this. The deed makes it clear that that space belongs to me. Honey, you need to understand that things work differently here in Brookhaven." Barbara adjusted her pearl necklace. "That driveway has been used by all the residents for decades. The previous owner, Margaret Wilson, never cared. But I do care, and it's my house now," Jessica insisted, feeling her frustration grow. "I need free access to my driveway. I'm an emergency doctor. I can be called at any time." "Well, maybe you should have thought of that before buying a house in such a traditional community." Barbara smiled condescendingly. "By the way, have you considered joining our HOA? Tom Parker, our president, would love to talk to you about it." Jessica knew that name well. Tom Parker was practically a local legend, and not for the best of reasons. As president of the Brookhaven Homeowners Association, he had a reputation for ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist, imposing fines for insignificant infractions and persecuting anyone who dared to challenge his decisions. "I have no interest in joining the HOA, Barbara. I just want them to respect my property," Jessica replied firmly. "Please move your car out of my driveway." "Of course, doctor. But you know, old habits are hard to change." Barbara winked, reaching for her car keys with purposeful slowness. That same afternoon, on returning from an exhausting shift, Jessica found not just 1, but 3 cars occupying her driveway. In addition to Barbara's BMW, there was an SUV she recognized as belonging to Tom Parker and a minivan she had seen parked a few houses down. Furious, she parked in the street and marched up to Barbara's house, where she found a small group gathered in the garden, including Tom Parker, a middle-aged man with gold-framed glasses and an impeccable navy blue blazer. "Dr. Morgan," Tom greeted her with false cordiality. "We were just discussing the traditions of our community. You know, here in Brookhaven, we really value neighborliness and sharing common spaces." "There is nothing communal about my private entrance, Mr. Parker," Jessica replied, keeping her voice controlled despite her anger. "And what you're doing amounts to trespassing." "Doctor, maybe we should discuss this at an official HOA meeting," Tom suggested, adjusting his glasses. "I'm sure we can come to an agreement that benefits the entire community." "There's nothing to discuss. The driveway is mine, it's on the deed, and I want all the cars removed immediately," Jessica stated firmly. The group exchanged glances, and Barbara gave a little laugh that made Jessica clench her fists. "Honey, you're new here. You still don't understand how things work at Brookhaven. We have our own rules, our own traditions. The only rules that matter are Georgia's property laws," Jessica replied, pulling out her cell phone. "If the cars aren't removed in 5 minutes, I'll call the police in a tow truck." "That would be very unpleasant, doctor," Tom commented, his tone now clearly threatening. "You know, the HOA has a lot of resources at its disposal. It would be a shame if we started finding violations on your property that needed to be documented." Jessica stared at the group, realizing that she was facing a bigger battle than she had imagined. It wasn't just about a driveway, it was about power control and trying to bend new residents to the will of an overbearing HOA. "Do as you wish," she replied, heading back to her house. But know that I will not give in. Not today, not ever. As she entered the house, Jessica was already planning her next steps. She would need a good lawyer and detailed documentation of each incident. If they wanted war, she was prepared to fight. After all, she hadn't gotten where she was by giving in to intimidation. Little did she know that this was only the beginning of a battle that would test not only her resolve, but also her ability to remain calm in the face of a growing campaign of harassment orchestrated by neighbors who considered themselves to own not only their own homes but the entire neighborhood. The week following the confrontation in Barbara's garden brought a new wave of provocations. Jessica woke up one morning to find her lawn covered in flyers from the HOA, all highlighting infractions on her property, from the height of the grass to the supposedly inappropriate shade of the house's exterior paint. At the hospital during a break between surgeries, Jessica consulted Miranda Chin, a fellow neurologist who also lived in Brookhaven. Tom Parker. Miranda shook her head as she sipped her coffee. He made my sister's life a living hell when she refused to remove a swing from her backyard. She ended up moving out after 3 months of harassment. I'm not going to let them intimidate me, Jessica replied, massaging her temples. I've already contacted a lawyer who specializes in property disputes. Good luck. The HOA has one of the most expensive law firms in Atlanta in its pocket. Rumor has it that Tom's son is a junior partner there. That afternoon, upon returning home, Jessica found an official notice from the HOA pinned to her door. The document, signed by Tom Parker, listed a series of serious violations that required immediate action, including a $500 fine for obstruction of traditionally shared common area, an obvious reference to her private driveway. While she was reading the document, a Range Rover pulled up in front of her house. Barbara Mitchell got out of the vehicle, accompanied by a woman Jessica didn't know. Dr. Morgan, this is Patricia Winters, our HOA compliance officer, Barbara introduced with her artificial smile. She's here to document some irregularities. Patricia, a middle-aged woman with a tablet in her hand, began photographing various angles of Jessica's house. We have reports of unauthorized modifications to the facade, doctor, and that tree in your yard exceeds the height limit allowed by regulation. What regulation? Jessica questioned, crossing her arms. My property is not connected to the HOA. You have no authority here. Oh, but we do, Patricia smiled, showing a folder of documents. According to the neighborhood's historical records, all properties in Brookhaven are subject to the association's guidelines. It's a restrictive clause that accompanies the deed. My lawyer disagrees, Jessica retorted, and I suggest you stop taking pictures of my property before I file a complaint for harassment. Just then, an ambulance drove down the street with its siren on. The sound reminded Jessica of the real reason for her concern about the blocked entrance. It wasn't just a matter of convenience, but of safety. In the evening, while reviewing documents with her lawyer Robert Caldwell, over Zoom, Jessica heard an engine noise. Looking out the window, she saw Tom Parker parking his car in her driveway. This is ridiculous, she muttered, interrupting the call. I'll call a tow truck. Wait, Robert interrupted her. Document everything. Take pictures, record videos. The more evidence we have of coordinated harassment, the stronger our case will be. Jessica followed the advice, but the situation continued to deteriorate. Over the next few days, her driveway became an unofficial meeting place for HOA members. Different cars appeared and disappeared, always blocking her access. The final straw came on a Wednesday evening. Jessica was on duty when she received an urgent call from the hospital. A patient with a brain hemorrhage needed immediate surgery. When she got home to get her emergency kit, she found 3 cars completely blocking her driveway. Desperate, she rang all the doorbells of the nearby houses, but no one answered. The minutes passed, and she knew that every moment was crucial for her patient. Finally, she had to call an Uber to get to the hospital. During the surgery, as she fought to save her patient's life, Jessica couldn't stop thinking about how fatal that delay could have been. The operation was successful, but by the narrowest of margins. The next morning, exhausted after the surgery, Jessica found Barbara and Tom chatting animatedly in front of their house, as if they were celebrating a victory. Good morning, doctor, Barbara waved. I hope you were bothered by the cars last night. We had an emergency HOA meeting, and there simply wasn't anywhere else to park. Jessica felt something break inside her. All the self-control she had maintained until that moment evaporated. Do you have any idea what you've done? A patient almost died because I couldn't access my own car. Now, doctor, don't be dramatic. Tom interfered, adjusting his glasses. If you just agree to join the HOA and respect our traditions. Traditions, Jessica laughed humorlessly. You called bullying and harassment traditions? Well, I got news for you. I just installed security cameras all over the property. Your every move is being recorded. And my lawyer is preparing a lawsuit not only against the HOA, but against each of you personally. Barbara's smile faltered for the first time. Tom Parker visibly paled. In addition, Jessica continued, her voice shaking with restrained anger. I have filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. What you did last night constitutes obstruction of emergency medical service. This could result in criminal charges. Now you're threatening us. Tom tried to maintain his authoritative posture, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. No, Mr. Parker. I'm just informing you of the legal consequences of your actions. And this is just the beginning. As she entered the house, Jessica could feel the stares of her neighbors burning into her back. War was officially declared, and she was prepared to fight with every legal weapon at her disposal. The next move would be theirs, but for the first time since it had all started, she had the feeling that she had finally found a way to strike back. The office of Dr. Daniel Harrison, head of the neurosurgery department at Emory University Hospital, was silent as he analyzed the documents Jessica presented. His gray eyebrows furrowed as he read the detailed account of the previous night's incident. This is very serious, Jessica, he said, removing his glasses. A deliberate obstruction that affects our ability to respond to medical emergencies, unacceptable. That's exactly why I came to you, Daniel, Jessica replied, adjusting herself in the leather chair. I need the hospital to formally endorse my complaint. This isn't just about me, it's about the safety of our patients. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door. Miranda Chin rushed in, holding her tablet. Sorry to intrude, but you need to see this, she said, turning the screen so they could both see it. It was a post on the Brookhaven Facebook group. Barbara Mitchell had shared a series of photos of Jessica's house accompanied by a long text accusing her of anti-community behavior and threats against respectable residents. The comments were a festival of misinformation and personal attacks. They're trying to tarnish your professional reputation, Miranda pointed out. There are people suggesting that you can't be trusted as a doctor because you don't respect the traditions of the community. Jessica felt her blood boil, but years of surgical training had taught her to stay calm under pressure. Perfect, she said, surprising her colleagues. Every defamatory comment is more evidence for our lawsuit. That same afternoon, her lawyer Robert Caldwell called an emergency meeting at his office in downtown Atlanta. The panoramic view from the 20th floor contrasted with the seriousness of the situation. We got the injunction, Robert announced, spreading out documents on his mahogany desk. Judge Donovan agreed that there is sufficient evidence of coordinated harassment. From now on, any HOA member who parks in your driveway will be subject to hefty fines and possible arrest for contempt. They're not going to like that, Jessica commented thoughtfully. No, they won't, Robert agreed. But there's more. We've discovered something interesting about Tom Parker. It seems he's using HOA funds to finance personal projects. My investigator found suspicious transfers to a construction company registered in his wife's name. The revelation was a powerful weapon, but Jessica knew she needed to be cautious. How should we proceed? For now, we'll keep it in reserve. But first, Robert picked up his phone and made a quick call. Officer Stevens is in place. The injunction will be delivered personally to Mr. Parker in a few minutes. When Jessica returned to Brookhaven, she found a small crowd gathered in front of Tom Parker's house. The bailiff had just delivered the documents, and the HOA president looked as if he had seen a ghost. Barbara Mitchell ran up to Jessica's car as soon as she parked. What have you done? She demanded, her normally composed face now contorted with rage. You can't sue us, we're a respectable community. I can and I did, Jessica replied calmly, locking her Tesla. And I suggest you remove that defamatory post from Facebook before you're included in the libel suit. You don't understand who you're dealing with, Barbara hissed. My husband is a partner in one of the biggest law firms in Atlanta. Interesting you should mention that, Jessica smiled. Because I just had lunch with Richard Mitchell. You see, he's one of the most respected surgeons at Piedmont Hospital. He was very interested to hear how your wife is trying to damage the reputation of a professional colleague. Barbara's face paled. Her husband, always absent due to long hours at the hospital, was her weak point, especially since he had no idea of her behavior in the neighborhood. News of the injunction and the lawsuit spread quickly through Brookhaven. Some neighbors who had always felt intimidated by the HOA but never had the courage to speak up began quietly reaching out to Jessica. "They fined my mom for having yellow roses instead of red ones," said Susan Reynolds, a teacher who lived 2 houses down. "She's 75, and that garden is her life." She ended up paying because she was afraid of losing her house. The stories multiplied: arbitrary fines, veiled threats, projects approved only through special contributions to the HOA. A pattern of abuse of power was beginning to emerge. That evening, while Jessica was reviewing the security cameras on her laptop, she noticed suspicious movement in her garden. Zooming in on the image revealed Tom Parker and 2 unknown men examining the boundaries of her property. Immediately, she activated the external lighting system, flooding the garden with light. The 3 men, startled like exposed cockroaches, running to an SUV parked on the street. "Officer Stevens," Jessica spoke into the phone. "Yes, all recorded. 3 trespassers, including Tom Parker. No, I don't want to press formal charges yet, but keep these images in your records. Something tells me we're going to need them soon." The battle was far from over, but for the first time since moving to Brookhaven, Jessica felt she had control of the situation. Tom Parker's empire was beginning to show cracks, and she was determined to expose every abuse, every irregularity, every petty tyranny that this HOA had imposed on the residents over the years. While preparing breakfast the next morning, Jessica watched through the kitchen window as Barbara Mitchell discreetly removed her BMW from the private driveway. The message was clear: the tide was beginning to turn. The email arrived at 3 in the morning, just as Jessica was finalizing the paperwork for an emergency surgery. The sender was anonymous, but the content made her heart soar: detailed financial spreadsheets from the Brookhaven HOA for the last 5 years, along with a series of compromising photographs. "Not everyone here is Tom's puppet," the message read. "Some of us have been waiting for years for someone brave enough to stand up to him." The images showed Tom Parker in suspicious encounters with City Hall employees, exchanging envelopes in empty parking lots. The spreadsheets revealed an elaborate scheme of overbilling on neighborhood maintenance contracts, with exorbitant amounts going to front companies. Jessica immediately forwarded everything to Robert Caldwell, her lawyer. His reply came a few minutes later: "That changes everything. Meet me at the office at 7 a.m. On the way to the meeting, Jessica noticed an unusual movement in front of Barbara Mitchell's house. Police cars were parked and officers were talking to Richard Mitchell, who looked devastated. Her phone rang. It was Miranda Chun. "You're not going to believe this," her colleague said without even waiting for a hello. "Barbara was caught trying to tamper with the hospital's medical records. She was trying to create evidence that you were negligent towards patients." Jessica felt a chill. How did she get access? Apparently she has a cousin who works in administration. They're both being detained right now. In Robert's office, the atmosphere was one of intense concentration. Besides him, there were 2 other lawyers and a private investigator. "This goes far beyond a dispute over a driveway," Robert explained, spreading documents out on the table. "Tom Parker essentially turned the HOA into his personal empire. We found evidence of extortion, tax fraud, and even bribery of public officials." "And Barbara," Jessica asked, "why was she so determined to harm me?" The investigator, a middle-aged man named Marcus, snorted. "We found out that Ms. Mitchell has an interesting history. She tried to get into medical school 3 times without success. Since then, she's developed an obsession with successful doctors. You're not the first professional in the field she's tried to sabotage." The revelation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor. Tom Parker had burst into the office, followed by security guards trying to restrain him. He pointed at Jessica, his face red with fury. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Decades of building this community, maintaining standards, protecting our values." "Values?" Jessica stood up calmly. "Is that what you call extortion and fraud?" "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert intervened, "I suggest you record this moment. Mr. Parker, your every word is being recorded." Tom seemed to wilt visibly. His impeccable blazer was rumpled, and his hands were shaking. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I built Brookhaven. Without me, it would just be another decaying suburb." Actually, Marcus, the investigator, removed an envelope from his briefcase. We found something interesting about this construction. Do you remember Margaret Wilson, the former owner of Dr. Morgan's house? Tom paled. She didn't sell the property voluntarily, did she? Marcus continued. In fact, you orchestrated a similar campaign of harassment until you forced her to sell well below market value. And then, curiously, the property was resold at a substantial profit to one of your front companies. That's defamation. Tom tried to regain his authoritative posture, but his voice betrayed panic. No, Mr. Parker, Robert smiled, that's evidence. And we have a lot more. I suggest you contact your lawyer immediately. At that moment, Jessica received a message from Susan Reynolds. Come quickly. You need to see this. When she arrived in Brookhaven, she found a surreal scene. Dozens of residents were gathered in front of the HOA headquarters, many holding protest signs. Years of abuse and intimidation had finally come to light. It's like a dam that broke, Susan explained as they walked through the crowd. After Barbara's story leaked out, everyone started sharing their experiences. Tom won't be able to keep it down. Jessica observed her neighbors. People who had previously seemed intimidated and submissive were now finding their voice. An elderly woman tearfully recounted how she was forced to remove the garden she had maintained for 30 years. A young couple revealed how they almost lost their home due to arbitrary fines. Dr. Morgan, a familiar voice, called out. It was Richard Mitchell, Barbara's husband, looking aged and tired. May I speak to you in private? In a quieter corner, Richard apologized profusely for his wife's behavior. She needs help, he admitted. Years of obsession and bitterness. I should have realized sooner. But I was always busy at the hospital, ignoring the signs. Jessica nodded understandingly. As a doctor, she knew that sometimes the deepest wounds were the invisible ones. The afternoon progressed with more revelations. Reporters began to arrive, attracted by the story of corruption and abuse of power in one of Atlanta's most exclusive suburbs. Tom Parker was seen leaving his house, escorted by police officers, while neighbors recorded everything on their cell phones. You know what's ironic, Miranda commented, observing the scene alongside Jessica. This all started because of a driveway. Jessica smiled, thinking about how something so seemingly simple had sparked a revolution in Brookhaven. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to say no for others to find the courage to do the same. As the sun set over the elegant colonial houses, Jessica realized that her fight for a private entrance had turned into something much bigger, a battle for dignity and justice in a community that had long forgotten the true meaning of neighborliness. The sun was rising over Brookhaven when the first TV vans arrived. Jessica watched from her kitchen window as reporters positioned their equipment, preparing to broadcast live the biggest story of homeowner association corruption Atlanta had ever seen. State Attorney General indicts president of Brookhaven HOA, announced the headline in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The article detailed how Tom Parker had built an empire of extortion and intimidation over 2 decades, using the neighborhood association as a front for various illegal schemes. Jessica's phone rang. It was Robert Caldwell. Have you seen the news? The FBI just got on the case. It seems our friend Parker was involved in similar schemes in 3 other states. And Barbara, Jessica asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Still in custody. The hospital is suing her criminally for attempted falsification of medical records. Richard filed for divorce this morning. The doorbell rang. It was Susan Reynolds, accompanied by a group of neighbors Jessica recognized from the previous day's demonstrations. Dr. Morgan, Susan began, visibly nervous. We've formed an interim committee to reorganize the HOA. We'd like you to be a part of it. Jessica almost choked on her coffee. Me, but I've spent the last few months fighting the HOA. Exactly, replied an elderly man she only knew by sight. You showed integrity and courage when we were all cowering. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need to rebuild our community. Before Jessica could respond, a commotion in the street caught her attention. Margaret Wilson, the former owner of her house, was getting out of a car with a cane. The white-haired lady had tears in her eyes as she looked at the property. I never thought I'd live to see this day, Margaret said when Jessica came to greet her. Tom Parker forced me to sell this house for a fraction of its value after my husband passed away. He said that if I didn't accept, he'd find enough violations to bankrupt me with fines. Margaret's story was just one of dozens that emerged over the next few hours. An impromptu meeting formed in her garden with residents sharing years of abuse and intimidation. The pattern was always the same: veiled threats, arbitrary fines, psychological pressure. Miranda Chin rushed in, interrupting the testimonies. "Jessica, you need to see this." She showed her tablet where a viral video showed Tom Parker being escorted out of his house the night before, hastily trying to destroy documents. "Investigators found a secret room in his basement," Miranda continued. "Decades of files detailing every scheme, every threat, every bribe. He documented everything obsessively." Jessica felt a chill. The magnitude of the corruption was greater than anyone had imagined. Her little battle for a driveway had inadvertently exposed a network of criminality that extended far beyond the boundaries of Brookhaven. In the afternoon, a formal assembly was called at the community center. More than 200 residents attended, many for the first time in years. The fear that had kept people apart had dissipated. "We need to rebuild not just our association, but our community." Jessica spoke into the microphone, surprising herself with her willingness to lead. "No more arbitrary rules or persecution. Let's create something based on mutual respect and true cooperation." One by one, neighbors volunteered for different committees. Susan Reynolds would take over the treasury, ensuring transparency in the accounts. Richard Mitchell, still shaken by the revelation about his wife, offered pro bono legal services to review and redraft all the bylaws. "What about your driveway?" someone asked, provoking nervous laughter from the audience. Jessica smiled. "It will be exactly what it always should have been: my private entrance. But more important than that is making sure that every homeowner in Brookhaven has their rights respected." At the end of the day, as the last reporters were leaving the neighborhood, Jessica found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was an old black and white photograph showing her house in the 1950s with a happy family posing in the driveway. On the back was a handwritten message from Margaret Wilson. "This house has always been a symbol of resistance. My parents built it when this neighborhood was still segregated. I'm glad it's found another guardian willing to fight for what's right." Jessica hung the photo in her living room, a reminder that some battles, however small they may seem at first, are part of a larger struggle for justice and dignity. Brookhaven was beginning a new chapter, and she surprisingly would be part of that rebuilding. That night, for the first time in months, her driveway was completely clear. But now that seemed less important. The real triumph was not in the physical space regained, but in the transformation of a community that had finally found its voice and its courage. As she prepared for another shift at the hospital, Jessica reflected on how a simple parking dispute had sparked a silent revolution in Brookhaven. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up against injustice to inspire others to do the same. The battle over the driveway was over, but the work of rebuilding Brookhaven was just beginning. And this time it would be done the right way, with transparency, respect, and true community spirit.